Gender bias in psychology. Discuss gender bias in psychological research. Refer to examples of alpha bias and beta bias, 16 marks. So gender bias, when we're considering human behaviour, bias is a tendency to treat one individual or group in a different way from others. In the context of gender bias, psychological research or theory may offer a view that doesn't justifiably represent the experience and behaviour of men or women, and it's typically women, such as the misrepresentation of women. Universality and bias. So, universality, any underlying characteristic of human beings that is capable of being applied to all, despite differences in upbringing and experiences. Gender bias and culture bias threaten the universality of findings in psychology. Psychologists possess beliefs and values that are influenced by the social and historical context which they live in. This may undermine psychologists' claim to discover facts about human behaviour that are objective, value-free and consistent across time and culture, and this would be universality. Alpha bias. Alpha bias is when psychological research exaggerates or overestimates differences between the two genders. So, such differences are typically presented as real and enduring, fixed and inevitable. These differences occasionally heighten the value of women but are more likely to devalue females in relation to males. An example of alpha bias is the socio-biological theory of relationship formation. This is the sexual selection theory. It claims that men are focused on just trying to impregnate as many females as possible to pass on his genes, whereas women are more choosy, and so female promiscuity is seen as against the nature of women, and they are shamed for it. Beta bias ignores, minimises, or underestimates differences between men and women. This can occur when women weren't included in the research process, but results were extrapolated to both genders. An example of beta bias is the fight or flight response. Early research into fight or flight was based exclusively on male animals. They were preferred for research because female hormones fluctuate. The fight or flight response was assumed to be a universal response to a threatening situation. Taylor et al. Suggests that the female biology has evolved to inhibit the fight or flight response, shifting attention towards caring for offspring tendency and forming defensive networks with other females, which is befriending. Females exhibit a tend and befriend response governed by the hormone oxytocin. Androcentrism is when something is male-centered. If our understanding of normal behaviour comes from research involving all male samples, then any behaviour that deviates from this standard is judged as abnormal or inferior. This leads to female behaviour being misunderstood or even pathologized, which means that it's taken as a sign of illness. For example, many feminists object to the category of premenstrual syndrome, PMS, because it medicates female emotions, for example, anger, by explaining these in hormonal terms. But male anger is often seen as a rational response to external pressures. A3. A limitation of is the problems of gender bias in psychological research. Gender-biased research may create misleading assumptions about female behaviour and validate discriminatory practices. It may provide scientific justification to deny women opportunities within the workplace or in wider society, for example, because of PMS. Other examples are Bowlby's theories of attachment. Gender bias in research is not just a methodological problem, but has may have damaging consequences which affect the lives and prospects of real women. This social sensitivity reduces the appropriateness of gender bias in research. One strength is that an understanding of gender bias leads to reflexivity. Researchers recognize the effects of their values on their work, so reflexivity. They embrace bias as an important aspect of their research process rather than seeing it as a problem threatening the objective status of their work. Studies of the lack of women in executive positions have revealed reflection on how their gender related experiences influence their understanding of events. Such reflexivity is an important development in psychology and may lead to greater awareness of the role of personal bias in shaping future research, thus increasing the appropriateness of gender bias research. A limitation is essentialist arguments are common in gender biased research. Many gender differences reported by psychologists are based on an essentialist perspective that gender difference is inevitable, so essential and fixed in nature. It's been found that scientific research in the 1930s showed that intellectual activity, for example attending university, shriveled a woman's ovaries and harmed her chances at giving birth. Essentialist accounts are often politically motivated arguments disguised as biological facts. This has many negative implications in discrimination, treatment of women, and creating a double standard, which reduces the appropriateness of gender bias research. A strength is feminist psychologists propose how gender bias can be avoided. So researchers / psychologists suggest a criteria that researchers can use to avoid gender bias. Women should be studied within meaningful real-life contexts and genuinely participate in research instead of being objects of study. These ways of doing research may be preferable and less gender biased than lab-based research.